It's a great pleasure. Well, first of all, can you all hear me? Not really. Try that. Is that better? It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor John Carey. He is not a stranger to St Giles, and we were just trying to remember what else he's done here. Certainly there was a talk on John Donne, and there was another talk on science. So you can tell just from that his interests are broad and his knowledge is deep. You may have heard him on the radio or all sorts of other places. He was at Oxford Literary Festival this year as well. So without any further ado, I would like you to welcome John.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Can you hear the band? Good. Thank you very much. Nice to see you. Of all Dickens' novels, Great Expectations is, I think, the one that most concerns itself with what he calls since Freud the unconscious, a region, if that's what it is, that expresses itself in dreams or in fantasies or in lies. And it's the unconscious, as you can observe it, if you can observe it, in Great Expectations, that I want to talk about today. Take first of all an example of a lie that reveals or seems to reveal the unconscious of a character in the novel. Let's look at what Pip tells his sister and Mr. Pumblechook after he returns from his first visit to Miss Havisham at Sappy's house. You remember that they question him about what happened in the mysterious mansion. And Pip satisfies their curiosity with a set of astonishing lies. He tells them that Miss Havisham was sitting in her room in a black velvet coach, and Estella handed in cakes and wine at the coach window on gold plate. Then they all got into the coach, and they watched while 4 immense dogs fought for veal cutlets out of a silver basket. Then they played with flags. Estella waved a blue one, Pip a red one, and Miss Havisham one covered all over with little gold stars. They also waved swords, which they got from a cupboard, where Pip saw pistols and jam and pills. These lies come, of course, from Pip's imagination, that's to say, from his unconscious. But how have they got there? We can see that the grandiose story is an attempt by Pip to compensate for the humiliation that he actually suffered at Miss Havisham's. But why the details? The dogs and the swords and the pistols and the cake and the wine and the jam. The swords and pistols mixed up in Pip's mind with food and with a store code are, I think, a compensatory rewriting of the trauma that Pip suffered when the squad of armed soldiers arrived in the kitchen of his home, from the pantry of which he had stolen food. Weapons and foodstuffs were strangely mixed up then, and he strangely mixes them up in his lies. Pip's lies rewrite his past and turn the soldiers' terrifying weapons into playthings. The huge dogs fed on veal cutlets seem also to be a transformation of something in Pip's past. When, during his visit to Sappy's house, Estella brought him out bread and meat to the courtyard, she gave him the food, he tells us, without looking at me, as insolently as if I'd been a dog in disgrace. Pip was so hurt and humiliated that tears came into his eyes, and Estella looked pleased to have caused them. And that's not the first time that someone has looked at someone else in the novel eating as if at a dog. When Pip gave Magwitch the stolen food on the marshes, he tells us, "I've often watched a large dog of ours eating his food, and I now noticed a decided similarity between the dog's way of eating and the man's. The man took sharp, sudden bites, just like the dog. He swallowed or rather snapped up every mouthful, too soon and too fast, and he looked sideways here and there while he ate. In all which particulars, he was very like the dog." And even that isn't the start of the link between dogs and eating in the novel. Further back still in chapter 1, when the convict leaps upon Pip in the churchyard, he addresses Pip as a dog, and it seems an edible dog. "You young dog," said the man, licking his lips, "what fat cheeks you are not. Darn me if I could eat them." So, Magwitch calls Pip a dog and wants to eat him, and Pip, giving Magwitch food, thinks him like a dog. And that makes it more hurtful when proud Estella gives him food as if he were a dog. And that perhaps is why, in the lies he makes up about his visit to Miss Havisham's, there are dogs and dogs fed on meat, but dogs which Pip is safely and distinctively elevated above in the black velvet coach which Estella and Miss Havisham sit in. So that's one way in which the unconscious may enter the novel through the imaginings of the character. But there's another way too. The novel seems sometimes actually to depict creatures of the unconscious, or rather creatures who might have come from folklore or myth or fantasy, which a genre is often associated with the unconscious. Miss Havisham, rotting away in her candlelit room, is a figment of that sort, with her great wedding cake swarming with spiders and beetles, and her yellowing bride's clothes. She seems to represent one of the phantom presences, the hag, the animated corpse, that inhabit nightmare and hover around the threshold of consciousness. Estella too seems to belong to this category of archetypes. She is the ice queen, alluring, untouchable, the woman as star. When Pip watches her in the ruined brewery at Saty's house, he says she passes among the extinguished fires and ascends some light stairs and goes out by a gallery high overhead as if she were going out into the sky. Her name means star, of course, and I think this episode explains why Miss Havisham waves a flag sprinkled all over with little golden stars in Pip's lying fantasy. And the convict on the marshes, fearsome, bestial, lamed by his leg iron and blundering among the graves like something misshapen. He's another of these nightmare presences. He is the ogre who eats children or thinks of doing so. So the hag, the ice queen, and the ogre. In no other novel has Dickens placed his narrator in such a trio of figures from the threshold of consciousness. In Freudian theory, the unconscious is made up of what we repress. And in Expectations, repression is a recurring theme. You could almost see the book as a series of case histories of repressions. Miss Havisham represses her own sexual and emotional drives in order to revenge herself on life. She teaches Estella to repress love and desire too. In our everyday lives, the novel suggests, It may be necessary for us to repress the private and vulnerable parts of ourselves. And the character who shows that is Wemmick, Jaggers' clerk. At home in his ramshackle castle, Wemmick is kind and loving and filial. He disarms himself, showing Pip his tenderness for his father and his pride in his gimcrack home. A home that's so revealing of his weakness and his need for security, the miniature castle. Once across the little drawbridge, Wemmick can, as it were, take off his armour. But as Pip walks back to the office with Wemmick, he watches him getting visibly drier and harder, and his mouth tightening into, he says, the likeness of a post office letterbox, which is what it's normally like at the office. And in that way, Wemmick is performing, if you like, a Miss Havisham act, making himself unfeeling and invulnerable. In that presentation of Wemmick, Dickens seems, I think, to be the first novelist to raise the modern problem of the duality of home and office, the need that modern life imposes for a dual personality, home self, human and unguarded, and the office self, dehumanized and repressed. Jaggers, Wemmick's employer, is the character who most draws attention to the problem of work and the repression it demands. Jaggers is a lawyer who has to mix with clients whom he detests and despises. While with them, he has to repress those feelings. But he shows in various ways that he feels contaminated by them. He's always washing his hands and carries around a smell of scented soap. After a particularly unpleasant encounter, Pip finds him not only washing his hands, but gargling and scraping the dirt out from under his fingernails with a penknife. When he has guests to dinner, Jaggers drops the plates they've used into a basket beside his chair, as if getting rid of something polluted. What Jaggers is representing is guilt, of course, representing and repressing. And Jaggers, a lawyer, washing his hands, can hardly fail to remind us of Pontius Pilate washing his, though whether Jaggers is consciously or unconsciously imitating that famous biblical hand washer, we don't know. Joe Gargery and his wife, Mrs. Joe, the unhappy couple Pip grows up with, are another case history of repression and the unsatisfied desires that accumulate around it. We wonder why Joe doesn't defend little Pip against Mrs. Joe's cruelty. Blacksmith is a grown man. In fact, he explains to Pip why he doesn't. His own father, he says, was a violent drunkard and often beat Joe's mother and Joe himself. So he vowed, he tells Pip, not to be violent. Joe's extreme gentleness is a direct result of that childhood trauma. He represses his own violence because he remembers his father's. However, Joe's gentleness is a terrible trial to Mrs. Joe. She's driven wild with frustration because she yearns for male violence. In the scene where Orlick insults her, she goes half mad with rage because Joe won't fight him. She screams and beats her bosom and pulls her hair down, and she does it all quite deliberately, Pip notices. Instead of lapsing into a passion, she consciously and deliberately took extraordinary pains to force herself into it, he says. Mrs. Joe's rage is an attempt, of course, to stir her infuriating limp husband to overcome his repression. The Jaggers is a loveless marriage. Jo tells Pip he married Pip's sister only because he took pity on her baby brother, Pip. To her husband then, Mrs. Jo isn't a sexual being at all. Her sexual nature and her potential for motherhood seem to be irrelevant to Jo. She's just Mrs. Jo, Pip's sister. No one ever uses her Christian name, though we do find eventually that she has one. Anyone know Mrs. Jo's Christian name? Sorry? Georgina Maria. Very good. Yeah, I see we have an educated audience. So, Mrs. Jo's rage and frustration and violent assaults on Pip are, we could say, the result of her not being treated like a woman, the result of her having to repress her female nature. It's strange and it's somehow offensive to us, but nevertheless the case. So Dickens seems to be telling us that what Mrs. Jo actually wants, what she yearns for, is male violence. He seems to be telling us this when he describes Mrs. Jo's behaviour after Orlick has battered her over the head with a convict's leg iron. She becomes gentle and compliant. And when Orlick's brought into her presence, Pip says she shows every possible desire to conciliate him and behaves with humble propitiation like a child before a hard master. It's almost as if she were grateful for being beaten over the head, almost as if Orlick has shown the male power that she's been longing to arouse in Jo. The most violent woman and the most spectacular exhibition of repression in the novel, though, isn't Mrs. Jo, but Estella's mother, Molly. Wemmick tells Pip that when he goes to dinner with Jaggers, he will see a wild beast tamed. By that he means Jaggers' housekeeper, Molly, who turns out to be Estella's mother, and who is an unhanged murderess. She strangled another woman in a barn on Hampstead Heath. Her powerful hands are lacerated by scars inflicted by her victim in her death throes. Jaggers shows her off like an animal in a menagerie, but she remains completely subservient, completely repressed, simply asks for permission to go away to the kitchen. Pip's description of her, it's in chapter 26, is one of the most extraordinary and obtrusive passages in all Dickens' writing. She is, Dickens writes, extremely pale, with large faded eyes and streaming hair. I cannot say whether any diseased affection of the heart caused her lips to be parted as if she were panting, and her face to bear a curious expression of suddenness and flutter. But I know that I had been to see Macbeth at the theatre the night before, and that her face looked to me as if it were all disturbed by fiery air, like the faces I'd seen rise out of the witch's cauldron. Years afterwards, I made a dreadful likeness of that woman by causing a face that had no other natural resemblances to it than it derived from flowing hair, to pass behind a bowl of flaming spirits in a dark room. Now that's truly extraordinary, I think you'll agree. Why should Pip have wanted in future years, years afterwards, to carry out this strange little experiment with flaming spirits in a dark room. Who was the woman that he got to pass behind the bowl of flaming spirits? Can't have been Estella, because Estella, we're told, does look like her mother. And this woman, Pip says, didn't except for the flowing hair. And why does Pip associate Molly with the witches in Macbeth? These questions aren't answered, but they're certainly raised. And they'll take us, I believe, out of the realistic mode into the region of spectres that arise from the unconscious. What Pip's describing when he remembers the heads that rise from the witch's cauldron in Macbeth is an apparition. And Great Expectations has other apparitions. Magwitch tells Pip that when he was a hired shepherd in Australia, he kept having apparitions of Pip, watching him eat. "Here's that boy again," he'd say, "and looking at me whilst I eat some drinks." Magwitch tells Pip of another apparition. Miss Havisham's brother Arthur went into screaming fits on his deathbed because he saw an apparition of Miss Havisham, all in white, coming to put a shroud on him. Pip has an apparition of Miss Havisham hanging by the neck from a beam in the old brewery at Sally's house. And when Pip is stricken with a fever after Magwitch's death, he hallucinates again, thinking that a voice keeps telling him that Miss Havisham is being burned in a dark furnace in the corner of the room. That connection of Miss Havisham with fire takes us to the next point I'd like to make, which isn't so much about the unconscious of people in the novel, but rather what you might call the unconscious of the novel itself. Fire is often used in Dickens' novels to show how repression leads to explosion. Think of the firing of the chateau by the revolutionaries in The Tale of Two Cities, for example. And fire particularly signals sexual passion. There's a scene in Hard Times when Louisa Gradgrind is being urged by her father to marry Bounderby, whom she detests. And she looks out of the window in Coketown at the factory chimneys, and she says, "There seems to be nothing there but languid and monotonous smoke. Yet, when night comes, fire bursts out, Father." And Gradgrind replies, "I do not see the application of that remark." But it's clear that we are meant to see the application of that remark. And that Louisa is imagining the Pearson Bounderby's sexual passion at night. Now that equation of fire with sexual passion must make us ask why, in Great Expectations, the repressed Miss Havisham catches fire. What does it tell us about the unconscious of the novel? What does the way Pip describes it tell us about his unconsciousness? This scene is in a way the climax of the novel. It's also the most suggestive example of repression leading to explosion or release. It happens in chapter 49. Pip, now a grown man, is revisiting Miss Havisham. He leaves her to have a look at the old brewery and then goes back to her room. I looked into the room where I had left her, and I saw her seated on a ragged chair upon the hearth close to the fire with her back towards me. In the moment when I was withdrawing my head to go quietly away, I saw a great flaming light spring up. In the same moment I saw her running at me, shrieking, with a whirl of fire blazing all about her, and soaring at least as many feet above her head as she was high. I had a double-caped greatcoat on and another over my arm, and I got them off, closed with her, threw her down and got them over her. that I dragged the great cloth from the table for the same purpose, and with it dragged down the heap of rottenness in the midst, and all the ugly things that sheltered there, that we were on the ground struggling like desperate enemies, and that the closer I covered her, the more wildly she shrieked and tried to free herself. That this occurred, I knew through the result, but not through anything I felt or thought or knew I did. I knew nothing until I knew that we were on the floor by the great table, and that patches of tinder, yet alight, were floating in the smoky air, which a moment ago had been her faded bridal dress. Then I looked round and saw the disturbed beetles and spiders running away over the floor, and the servants coming in with breathless cries at the door. I still held her forcibly down with all my strength, like a prisoner who might escape, and I doubt if I even knew who she was, or why we had struggled, or that she had been in flames, or that the flames were out, until I saw the patches of tinder that had been her garments, no longer alight, but falling in a black shower around us. Assistance was sent for, and I held her till it came, as if I unreasonably fancied, I think I did, that if I let her go, the fire would break out again and consume her. When I got up, with the surgeons coming to her with other aid, I was astonished to see that both my hands were burned, for I had no knowledge of it through the sense of feeling. Some unspeakable sexual encounter is, I'd suggest, intimated and repressed in this account. I don't mean, of course, that any sexual encounter took place in reality between Pip and Miss Havisham. I mean there is very distinctly a sexual element in the writing, in the unconscious, if you like, of the writing. Pip throws Miss Havisham to the ground and struggles with her, though she shrieks to be released. It's like a rape. Furthermore, her clothes come off, patches of tinder that had been her garments float in the air around them. We notice that in his account of the incident, Pip does not just protest his innocence. He says his mind blanked out. He didn't know what he was doing. I knew nothing until I knew that we were on the floor. I doubt if I even knew who she was. In other words, his mind represses the scene. He refuses to acknowledge that it took place. What Miss Havisham's body would look like, as Pip put it, with every vestige of her dress burned off, what it would be like to hold her in that condition is something that his mind refuses to recall. The horror is too great. Notice too that though it seems like a sexual assault, it's not quite clear who assaults who. Pip throws her down and holds her struggling, but it's she who runs at him on fire, and he's afraid when it's over that she'll catch fire again, and he can't quite admit this to himself. I held her as if I unreasonably fancied, I think I did, that if I let her go, the fire would break out again. The idea which Pip half disowns is that Miss Havisham is dangerously inflammable, a source rather than a victim of violence. So, this scene seems to tell us something about Pip's unconscious, but it also tells us something about what you might call the book's unconscious. The unconscious works through connections that are repressed. And this Miss Havisham scene connects very strangely with an earlier scene in the book. The earlier scene is in chapter 40. It's when Pip is trying to disguise Magwitch. Magwitch, to aid the disguise, has put hair powder on his hair. This is what Pip says about it. I can compare the effect of it to nothing but the probable effect of rouge upon the dead. So awful was the manner in which everything in him that it was most desirable to repress started through that thin layer of pretense and seemed to come blazing out of the crown of his head. Well, you see how that phrase about Magwitch's repressed self, blazing out of the crown of his head, you see how it connects with Miss Havisham, fire all about her and soaring at least as many feet above her head as she was high. But the strange thing about the two scenes is that the Magwitch scene comes first. That is, Pip imagines seeing fire blaze out above Magwitch's head before he actually sees the fire blazing out above Miss Havisham's. If it was the other way around, there'd be no problem. We'd assume Pip just remembered the real Miss Havisham scene when imagining it happening to Magwitch. It doesn't happen the other way around. And the connection between Miss Havisham blazing and Magwitch blazing can't be in Pip's unconscious because he hasn't yet seen Miss Havisham blazing when he imagines it happening to Magwitch. That's what I mean when I say the connection is in the unconscious of the novel. So we need to ask, why does the unconscious of the novel, or if you prefer Dickens' unconscious, connect Miss Havisham and Magwitch in this way? What I'd suggest is this. Dickens is notoriously fond of giving children surrogate parents in his novels. And clearly, Magwitch and Miss Havisham are Pip's surrogate parents. Magwitch says, "I am your second father, you are my son." Pip, of course, recoils from Magwitch with shock and loathing. I recoiled from his touch as if he had been a snake, he says. Though he also feels guilt because he owes everything to Magwitch. I think that Dickens has dramatised there the essential features of what Freud was later to call the Oedipus complex. The son hates and wants to destroy the father and is crippled by guilt as a result. In Freud, of course, the reason for the hatred is the son's love for the mother. And maybe that allows us to see more clearly what's happening in the novel's unconscious, in that scene where Pip struggles with screaming and fiery Miss Havisham and her clothes come off. If it's the rape of the mother that this scene points to, we can see why Pip so severely represses the part he played in it. I doubt if I even knew who she was. I knew nothing. Well, that, as I say, is how Freud, or Freudian, might interpret that scene. But of course, the scene isn't the Freudian one. Miss Havisham isn't Pip's mother, for one thing. For another, Estella has to be fitted into the equation somewhere. Pip meets Estella, as well as Miss Havisham, in the dark, candlelit room. And we know that Pip connects Estella and Miss Havisham in his unconscious. We know that because of a Freudian slip. When he's talking to Joe Gargery, Pip inadvertently, unconsciously, runs the names of Estella and Miss Havisham together. Estavisham, he says. Joe corrects him. There's no Estavisham, it's Estella and Miss Havisham. But Pip's Freudian slip shows how they're fused in his unconscious. Freud said that in the unconscious, opposites, mutually irreconcilable components exist side by side. And in Pip's unconscious, Estella and Miss Havisham are, anyway, literally the same. They're both versions of the Freudian mother. Of Estella, Pip says, she seemed much older than I, of course, being a girl. Estella, the ice queen, represents what's forbidden, enticing but aloof and untouchable. She is the alluring, unlawful, taboo mother bride. Now we might wonder why Dickens was preoccupied with these phantoms when he wrote Great Expectations. He started the novel in 1860. It was the first novel he had written since the breakup of his marriage to Catherine and the beginning of his affair with the young actress Ellen Turner. It doesn't take much imagination to see the aging, physically repulsive Miss Havisham and the enticing young Estella as versions of those two women, Catherine and Ellen. It seems clear that at the start of the affair with Ellen, the affair wasn't sexual. Dickens hotly denied any erotic interest. He said in his letter to the press that Ellen was as pure as his own dear daughters. So we can see why Estella, in the novel, is made alluring but forbidden. And we can see why Dickens, at this point in his life, is so interested in repression. I'd like to make two other points quickly before I finish. Given that the unconscious seems so important to the novel, it seems worth noting a feature that apparently appeals strongly to Dickens' unconscious, but still eludes any rational explanation. The feature I mean is the first name of Orlick, Joe Gargery's assistant. Pip says about Orlick, he pretended that his Christian name was Dolge, D-O-L-G-E, a clear impossibility, but he was a fellow of that obstinate disposition that I believe him to have been the prey of no delusion in this particular, but willfully to have imposed that name upon the village as an affront to its understanding. In fact, Dickens had decided on the name Dolge for Orlick before he began the novel. His memorandum book contains Dolge, D-O-O-L-G-E, changed to Dolge, D-O-L-G-E, along with other names like Gargery and Pumperdink. Clearly the name meant too much to Dickens to give it up. But at the same time, it sounded so unlikely, a clear impossibility, as Pip says, that he has to pretend it's a false name that Orlick makes up just to annoy the villagers. Dolge contains the letters of the word dog, but it's not the same as dog. And as it seems to have no conscious explanation, it appears to be another aspect of the novel that we must ascribe to the unconscious. And this Orlick, you could say, is brought into the novel to bear its load of evil. He's explicitly likened to Cain, and as Cain, he contrasts with Magwitch, whose first name, you remember, is Abel. And perhaps it's because Orlick is the outcast, the other, that Dickens had to have a name for him that's from outside language, a name that acquired its meaning, whatever its meaning was, only in Dickens's unconscious. So that's one of my two final points. The other is about the strange connection the novel makes between the spiders in Miss Havisham's wedding cake and, of all people, Bentley Drummond, the man Estella marries. The cake is described in chapter 11. It's all covered in cobwebs and is like a black fungus. And Pip sees spiders with, he says, blotchy bodies, running home to the cake. Later, in chapter 26, when Pip is having dinner with Jaggers, the lawyer, a very strange thing happens. Jaggers takes Pip to the window and points to someone outside and says, "Who's the spider?" "The spider?" I said. "The blotchy, sprawling, sulky fellow." "That's Bentley Drummond," I replied. And at the end of chapter 26, we are told that Bentley Drummle, now referred to as the Spider, goes home to the family home. What is the explanation for this? Why should Jaggers call Drummle the Spider, and a blotchy spider? Why are the blotchy spiders that run home to the wedding cake and Drummle, the blotchy spider, connected? I don't know, of course. But we can make a guess. Drummle, we remember, marries Estella. He gains the sexual prize. Is there something sexual about the cake? Well, obviously, in a sense there is. Miss Havisham says, it's a great cake, a bride cake, mine. So, Estella is a bride, and the cake is a bride cake. And blotchy spiders penetrate the bride cake. And Drummle, a blotchy spider, penetrates Estella. He enters that curiously suggestive family hole, which it takes very little verbal ingenuity to interpret as part of a woman's body. Here too, we may seem to be dealing with meanings that the novel represses. They aren't spelled out. But Jaggers' strange identification of Drummle as a blotchy spider, like the cake spiders, seems to make some such meaning hard to resist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are any questions that you would like to ask John Carey, just be warned, what are you revealing of your own self?
Yes.
Now I invite questions. Oh, be brave. I'll give you an observation. Look at someone drinking a cup of water, a glass of water. It's fascinating that the eyes go from side to side before they take any drink. That's interesting. There we go. Start them off.
I was just very struck by your description of how Joe Garvey benefits from somebody else beating up his wife, and how similarly Hip outsources the violence, gets, that Bentley Drummle beats up Stella, essentially says she's broken spirited and will be a more docile bride. And I just wanted you to speak to that. It seemed very useful to me.
Very interesting, yeah. I love your phrase, outsources the violence. He does it quite a lot, don't you think, right from the start? I often think of that, about the death of Bill Sykes, on a twist, remember Bill Sykes, who very conveniently manages to hang himself on the chimney top, somehow, so he goes on with a slip knot. And Cabinet Punishment takes place, it doesn't really take place, just a mistake, Yeah, I think it's quite right. And it's a very strange thought, isn't it, about expectations that. I mean, it's analogous, after all, in a way, to what happens to Mrs. Joe, as you say. I mean, it's still
she's a better wife for the violence. That Mrs. Joe is a better wife for the violence that she suffered. It's a very unattractive proposition.
yes. I said offensive, really. To us it really is offensive. Maybe just not so offensive to a Victorian reading, depending on one chose to think. But I do. Anyway, yes, I agree. I think she does outsource the violence in relation to the story. Do you prefer the original ending or the change ending? Big question. This really does test the subconscious. I mean, do you like to think that Joe, that Estella might marry?
Well, that's the ending that I read the first time I read it, and that's what I read when I was about 12.
Yeah.
That's what I didn't know about textual variation. I just read the book I was just.
No, that's right. Whereas Dickens certainly did not intend that, definitely didn't control all the literary suggestions it had. It's actually slightly with a bit of the story. Yeah. I agree with you, really. I think it probably is the case that you prefer the one you first read. It's hard to change the novel to that.
When the novel was first published, was any of what you have just told us remarked upon, or was Victorian society too repressed to state all this, do you think?
Oh, I don't think it was remarked on, and I don't think it would have been until Freud had happened, as it were. We have Michael Slater in the room, who is probably the greatest Dickensian scholar alive, so he will correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, no Victorian critic would have pointed out such stuff, would they? Got no sense. I think not. I've never come across a Victorian comment on the Louisa Gradgrind scene, which seems to us so obvious, and which Dickens certainly meant, because after Mr. Gradgrind has said, "I do not see the application of that remark," Dickens writes something like that. To do him justice, he did not, didn't he? I mean, it's made absolutely clear. But very daring scene that Dickens was very daring, even with phallic chimney, for heaven's sake. I mean, very peaceful.
I thought it had rather a hard deal in your talk when he quenched the fire that was consuming Mrs. Whatnot. I just thought that when he was hugging her and putting the flames out, it was actually a very good thing to do, whether it was flames of desire, flames of whatever, fire. But if she survived because of it, I'm a bit worried by your connection between sex and violence.
Yeah, well, I may be completely wrong. I mean, that is the trouble about discussing the unconscious, because it is the unconscious, and so you can't, of course, be sure. You're saying that what Pip did, how he behaved was perfectly, in the circumstances, perfectly correct, perfectly appropriate, pulling out the fire. I entirely agree with that. All I was alerted by, reading the scene, was this repeated affirmation that he just didn't know who she was, didn't know anything. Somehow his mind had that now. Now you might say, oh, well, that's a perfectly naturalistic description of shock. Yeah, it might be. And I'm sure it's usually been read in that way. But once you start thinking about repression and the incidents of repressive cases in the novel, that obvious kind, that admission of repression, starts to set me thinking. But I did say, I was careful to say, of course, there is no sexual content, in fact, in the scene between Pip and Miss Harrison.
But he's rescuing her. He's rescuing her.
Absolutely, sure. He doesn't, of course, actually rescue her. She dies, as you know. Yeah, absolutely.
Nowadays, the British English libel laws make it important for writers to actually disguise individuals as fiction in order to escape legal sanctions. I just wondered how far you think Dickens consciously recognised that Miss Havisham was a sort of parody of his abandoned wife. Was he disguising this consciously, or was he unconsciously constructing Miss Havisham as a shadow of his wife?
You can't tell, can you? I can't believe for it. And there are other sources for the Miss Havisham figure, of course. It's the juxtaposition of the beautiful, desirable young woman and the older woman, bride, that makes me think, in the context of the year 1860, that might have been in Dickens' mind, but I don't know. Nothing Dickens ever said or wrote implies that, but then how could it do? I just find it, once I've thought about it, hard to put entirely out of my mind. He did, it's clear that what he was doing to his wife played on his mind in a guilty way. There's a story called The Bride's Chamber, title now. She wrote in 1857, when the split up was happening, about a man who marries a young girl, actually a young girl who is the daughter of a woman who years ago jilted him, and brings her up as a complete or subordinate, complete wraith of self-abasement and propitiation, and simply tells her to die. Day after day, just tells her to die. She does eventually die. And when you think that here is Dickens, terrified that the truth about what's going on will get out, turning his wife out of the house, telling lies about her, terrible lies, that she no longer mother, didn't think her sort of fit to live the kind of life she had to live with him, children didn't like her, and so all this stuff, publicly. It seems to me hard to disentangle that from this story about the wife killer, using just words. And so that strengthens my feeling that maybe in the Miss Havisham Esther contrast, there's something autobiographical, but it's just assumption.
Just wondered what you made, John, of the fact that the wife that was killed in that story, her name is Ellen.
Yeah, absolutely. Furthermore, as you will know, he was in Lancaster. And just the week before, 2 weeks before, a man had been hanged for murdering his wife, who was called Harman. Yeah. These things do fit, sure.
And then the story goes on, doesn't it? Because the murderer is himself. He then is attacked by the young lover of the wife, who is a kind of image of the young Dickens with brown, flowing hair. And he kills him and he buries him under a tree.
Throws a billboard, cleaves his scarf.
And then buries him. I think, is it Bloodlands that dig him up later on? I mean, he then goes back to an old story he'd written from outside of his book.
Hunted Down.
No, before that, an older one. The Madman's Manuscript.
Oh yes, indeed.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I just wondered, John, if I could ask you, whether you think there's any, with Miss Havisham and Estella, I'm very struck when Miss Havisham says about Estella how she took away her heart and put ice in its place. Do you remember she says that? And I'm just wondering if you think that he was at all influenced by Hans Christian Andersen and the story of the Ice Queen and so on? Because of course he knew Andersen.
He knew Andersen, yeah.
I'm not sure whether that story had been written at that time, but I think it probably has.
I don't know that either, but it sounds very likely to me. It's interesting how much he was disappointed by Andersen when he turned up and stayed in the house. He said, didn't he, that seemed an eternity to those.
Well, it was a bit difficult when you have a guest who demands to be shaved by the oldest son of the house every morning.
And who kept,
it wasn't an easy guest.
Kept all his belongings in his boots for security of the British people. Yes. But still, Andersen, kind of work that Andersen was doing was deeply interested to Dickens, clearly. And I mean, there is a lot of, as I sort of suggested, a lot of folklore does get into, I think, those particularly. I'm not sure why, just at that point. But think the Ice Queen idea is, yeah, I think that's it.
And I suppose the Ice Queen donkey inside.
Where are Dombey and Son?
Edith.
Oh, Edith Dombey.
Yes.
Yeah. She's a very complicated figure, Edith, isn't she? I mean, her eloping with Carker is a very unlikely thing, don't you think? It's not, that's not Ice Queen, is it? Do you know? You can say, well, she just does it as a kind of act of hostility against Dombey that she never obviously intends to an affair with Carker. I've just been reading, there's a book which Barbara Hardy, the great Victorian critic of Victorian literature, just written a little book called Dorothy's Daughters, short stories, which are little sequels to particular novels, 9 novels. One of them is Dorothy's one, and what she does is a conversation after the novel's action between Edith and Mr. Dombey, a kind of reconciliation. It's very moving. She calls him Paul, which you never think. It's Paul. And writing about it in a note, Barbara Hardy refers to the scene which most people forget, and I've forgotten, when Edith offers a kind of reconciliation in the novel to Dombey, referring to her son who was drowned. She had a son by the first marriage. Because remember, Dombey asks the major whether she's ever had any children, because he wants to breed by her and so on. He said there was a boy of 5 who was drowned. And this short story by Barbara Hart is a kind of continuation of that reconciliation scene. So she makes her scene not just an Ice Queen.
This one more.
I have a question, and actually it's sort of a small comment which I don't know what to do with. First, I'm really interested in this concept of sort of the novel's unconscious, and normally when we think of unconscious, we associate it with individuals, right? And presumably the individuals involved here would be either Dickens' own unconscious, or Pip's, because Pip is the one who's narrating the novel. In fact, it's director with Spectres, right? It's a memoir. So I was hoping you could just sort of explain a little bit more what you mean by this concept of the novel's unconscious. And then the small comment I had actually deals with Orley. Because one thing which occurs to me is the other act of self-naming that takes place in the novel is, of course, Pip's own. He says in the first page of the novel, I couldn't say Philip Pyrrhic, so I called myself Pip. And that's the very last time anybody in the novel refers to either Philip or Pyrrhic to talk about Pip. So it seems like there's an interesting connection between those two acts of self-name. I don't know what to do with that. Maybe you do, but yeah, so.
No, I don't really. I mean, I share, you see, your feeling about how difficult it is. For sure, there's something there, but how difficult it is with the unconscious to extricate what, well, first of all, what Dickens means to happen or to be thought and what he doesn't. I mean, there are moments in the novel, I think, where you can be pretty sure that he is directing your attention towards something you might call the unconscious. For example, when Estella reveals to Pip that when he fought her pocket, she was watching, and says something like, come, imagine what curious little person she was to have done, of course, very naughty. And Pocket thinks he won the fight, doesn't he? When he later on, it's a wonderful scene, the Pocket fight scene, I think, because it's the first time you realise that Pip is, so to speak, a blacksmith's assistant, you know, because he doesn't talk like someone who can simply fell another boy. But of course, Pocket is hopeless, powerless against this young blacksmith. But he remembers it later, Pocket, as him winning. So Dickens is certainly interested in how you unconsciously redo the past. Yeah? Once you've got that, once you know that it is the unconscious happening, and that what leads me to be interested, what you object to about why should someone say, I can't remember, I have no idea. Why? That's as far as I go really. I think you can't be so.
Just one thing about names. I suppose it's been commented on often. Sidney's sonic sequence, Astra, Phil and Stella.
Yes.
And this must surely have been relevant to Dickens when he was thinking of Philip and
I think that's absolutely right. It's a strange thought, because Michael will correct me, but I don't remember any allusion to Professor Philip Sidney in the whole of the Dickens letters, do you? He knew Shakespeare backwards, of course, but he's odd. And of course, with the Philip tie, it seems impossible that it should be Charles. I think he must have just heard it.
Thank you very much for today. I think it's stimulated our imaginations and touched our unconsciousness. I wonder what stories it'll stimulate for you as you walk away. Thank you very much.
Thank you.